In D&D, when an elemental creature dies, its essence is scattered back to whatever plane it originated from. Now you'd think that would make elementals immune to becoming undead horrors bound to shamble forward in search of brains or whatever, right? Based on the title of this video, you probably know I'm about to tell you that's not true, because if there's one thing you need to understand about necromancers, it's that they will always discover new and increasingly terrifying ways to defile the sanctity of life. Undeath finds a way. As it turns out, that way is to tap the essence of an elemental at the moment of its death and corrupt it with a colossal injection of necrotic magic. The results are both varied and horrifying in such a profound way, I can't help but get excited when talking about it. When it comes to the spooky monsters that populate our tales of terror, they've all got some kind of angle that us humans find off-putting or downright disgusting in some way or another. Zombies and the undead, sure, are usually gross, gory reminders of the grave, but one of their most important elements is the partial or even total loss of identity. To become a zombie is to lose everything that makes you, you, and be relegated to inhabiting a shambling corpse and a mess of other shambling corpses. As humans, holding that sense of personal identity is very important to us, and becoming a zombie is a total corrupted inversion of everything we are, which is what makes them scary. I'm a big fan of this concept when applied to all undead creatures, because the inversion of a thing often strikes us as uncanny and therefore wrong or even sad. And the creatures I'm going to show you today are kind of both. Today we're taking a journey back to the Libris Mortis from D&D 3rd edition to look at 4 creatures, each of which is an undead mockery of an elemental. If this sounds familiar to some of you, that's probably because it isn't the first time I've talked about these creatures. 8 years ago, I made a video about them, but I've learned a lot in 8 years about game design, and these creatures have always stuck in my mind as worth revisiting. And I got so lost in the sauce updating these monsters that I ended up just making one of them into an entirely new creature. So whether you're here for the first time or you just want to see how I've made these horrible abominations even more horrible, please allow me to share with you one of my all-time favorite groups of undead. While all of the basic elementals in D&D are equally powerful, not all undead are created equally. So, going from weakest to strongest, the first creature we're going to talk about is the undead water elemental, otherwise known as a Desiccator. When a water elemental is corrupted in undeath, its body shrinks down into a small humanoid creature with no eyes, a gaping maw that takes up nearly the entire head, and dry, cracked, salt-encrusted skin. Keeping in mind the themes of inversion and longing that are assigned to most undead, these horrific little monsters are cursed with an inescapable craving for water. They're most often found in deserts, especially ones that are artificially created in places where water used to be abundant. You can hear them coming from pretty far away on account of the fact that they are always gasping and clawing at themselves as if they were drowning on land. But that's just it. They are desperate for water wherever they can get it, and no amount they find will ever be enough. An oasis or other small body of water might provide them with a brief reprieve, but it will be utterly absorbed before long, like dumping a liter of liquid on the sands of a desert, and inevitably they'll move on to desiccate the next source of water they find. And you know what provides a great source of water in the desert? Living creatures. Using their desiccating breath, they can inhale the moisture from all living creatures in a 15-foot cone, causing some constitution damage and giving the Desiccator some temporary hit points. The con damage is only 1 point, but those points add up, especially when you look at their primary melee attack, Touch of Fatigue. This attack deals a bit of bludgeoning damage, but it also gives the creature a level of exhaustion if they fail their save. While the Desiccator may only be a CR2 monster, they can be very deadly if their target is unlucky, and if they're swarming, they've been known to leave behind entire villages without a drop of moisture to be found, just piles of mummified bodies and dried up wells. Next up in the hierarchy, we have the undead fire elementals, also known as Cinderspawn. Cinderspawn have a CR of 5, making them the only undead elemental with the same challenge rating as all of their living counterparts. In Undeath, Cinderspawn are burnt out, gaunt, 10-foot tall humanoid shapes that smolder with freezing cold blue flames. As you probably guessed, they are stricken with the desire for heat, craving desperately to feel the warmth and raw life energy that once burned all around them. They're drawn to all sources of heat, open flames, magical fire, warmth of the sun, or body heat. It doesn't matter to them. They will greedily soak up any and all warmth they can find just to feel those fleeting seconds of normalcy. These guys have some really cool abilities as well that once you see in action feel so obvious but are really well thought out in my opinion. Obviously when they attack in melee they deal cold damage because they're freezing cold undead. Makes sense. But I also gave them essentially the effects of chill touch, meaning that when they do hit someone with a melee attack, the target can't regain hit points for a round as their life energy is being sapped away. But these guys aren't just cold, they're practically shivering at all times as they desperately draw in all heat around them. So they have an aura that, in stark contrast to the fire elemental's burning effects, causes cold damage to all creatures for just existing near them. I also gave them a trait called light absorption, which again is meant to contrast the fire elemental's natural penchant for illuminating the area around them on account of, being made of fire. So Cinderspawn instead lower the light level around them from bright to dim or dim to dark, as any light sources sputter and struggle to stay alight in the presence of such a light and fire hungry creature. Now usually when a creature deals a ton of damage belonging to a specific type, they are resistant if not straight up immune to that damage type, right? Like you wouldn't see a fire elemental and think, I think a fireball will slow him down. It turns out there are some things fireball just can't solve. I know, I was surprised too. But the Cinderspawn is an extremely rare case of a monster being straight up vulnerable to the type of damage that it deals itself. They're so desperate for heat, right? So if you deal cold damage to a Cinderspawn, they really don't like that, and it's super effective. On the flip side, they're immune to fire damage because they want that. In fact, taking fire actually heals them. So maybe don't feed fire to the thing that wants to consume fire. Much like the Desiccator, the Cinderspawn also has the chance to deal some ability damage with their Devour Spark bonus action. This is pretty straightforward. They just target someone within 10 feet and they drain the creature for a D4 charisma and give themselves some temp HP. I do find it really interesting that they attack charisma and not constitution, for example, but I kind of like that too. They're not simply hungering for the literal warmth created by a creature's body, but for the essence of what it is to be alive, which is really fucking sad the more you think about it. The other thing that makes Cinderspawn outliers among the undead elementals is that they're by far the most intelligent. It seems almost like a cruel joke that they actually gain a boost to their intelligence score when they become undead, but they can and will straight up converse with anyone who speaks their language. I mean, all of these creatures that we're going to talk about today speak the appropriate dialect of Primordial that type of elemental would, but Cinderspawn are just as intelligent as any humanoid creature, and you know how much I love an intelligent monster. But moving into the next tier of danger, we have everyone's favorite undead air elementals, the Voidwraith. Appearing as a medium-sized billowing cloud of black smoke with two burning motes of light acting as a facsimile of eyes, the Voidwraith, much like an air elemental, is an ever-flowing manifestation of something nearly intangible. Voidwraiths are so ridiculously cool, both in terms of aesthetics and mechanics. I've run many encounters with these guys, and it always results in a lot of horrified player noises. First and foremost, one of the things that makes these CR6 creatures so dangerous is the fact that they can fly 90 feet per round, and they've got that pesky airform trait, which allows them to fit through any gap that air can pass through, or even into the same space as another creature. Keeping in line with our themes of longing for that which was taken from them, Voidwraiths crave air, which at first seems like it wouldn't actually be that bad. I mean, there's air all around us. Just take a breath, forehead. But they specifically crave air that holds a smidge of life essence, which isn't easy to come by outside of your standard air elementals, which are the most common source. The next most common source is going to be the breath currently inside the lungs of a living creature. Moving at incredible speeds, a Voidwraith can rapidly envelop its target and begin to literally draw the life out of them using its siphon breath attack, causing a chunk of necrotic damage and decreasing the target's maximum hit points by the amount of damage dealt. But the real threat presented by this creature comes from simply being near it. Voidwraiths are constantly pulling in the air around them, and this means that there are blowing winds within 10 feet all around them that blow out candles, disperse fog and gas, and also make someone moving away from them cost twice as much movement as the air is constantly pulling in. But the space the Voidwraith is in itself, and every 5-foot space it touches, is subject to the creature's airless aura. This area is a space of of near vacuum as the Voidwraith absorbs every last bit of air around it, which has the effect of muting all sound in the area, so while the wind blowing from the Voidwraith is certainly audible, the creature itself, along with anything or anyone in its area, is completely silent. Every time a creature starts their turn within 5 feet of the Voidwraith, they have to make a Constitution save to hold what breath might still remain inside their lungs. If they fail that save, the Voidwraith gains a few hit points, and the creature suffers a level of exhaustion. Depending on which version of the 5e rules you're using, exhaustion has different effects, but either way, it's really bad. Now this exhaustion only lasts until you manage to get away from the Voidwraith for a full round, starting your turn outside its area of influence, but because they are extremely fast and because of how attacks of opportunity work, you often end up deciding if you want to risk making another con save and enduring a full round next to this thing, or trying to escape, maybe even managing to hide somewhere it can't find you long enough to catch your breath. Because whether this monster kills you by siphoning away your life or straight up suffocating you, it's a war of attrition that once you start to lose can be very difficult to come back from without some clever decision making, which is a big part of why I like this monster so much. I've seen party members wander off on their own and get ambushed by one of these things and then find themselves unable to call for help from the group because the area of silence around the Voidwraith makes it impossible to do so. So instead they use their action in combat to cast Message, which potentially saved their life. I've seen non-rogue characters use their turn in combat to take the hide action so that they can take a breath, literally, before jumping back into combat on the following turn. I've seen characters use their turn to pull each other out of melee with a Voidwraith so that their ally can start their turn outside the area of suffocation and lose their exhaustion levels. Voidwraiths aren't entirely without weakness though. On account of their vacuous nature, they themselves can't hear anything, so they rely almost entirely on sight to target prey, meaning that making a lot of noise isn't usually an issue when you're trying to go undetected. This is not something necessarily immediately obvious either, but it is something that once your players realize completely changes the dynamic of the tactics in real time, which is so much fun to watch. Ultimately, it's a highly engaging creature that forces you to use mechanics in this game that very rarely come up in initiative, because if you don't think outside the box when dealing with a Voidwraith, you will die. Now, onward to the dreaded fourth stop of our journey, a creature of undead earth, the Necromental. This is where the original cast of Undead Elementals sort of falls apart in my opinion. The Desiccator, Cinderspawn, and Voidwraith all have extremely strong themes, really cool abilities, great visuals, and just solid designs overall. The Necromental is just kinda bad. Let me tell you what it is, what I think happened, and how I tried to fix it. So a Necromental visually looks pretty cool. They're towering undead earth elementals comprised of soil from a graveyard, complete with tombstones and skeletons. They do all of the standard earth elemental smashy stuff, and rather than attacking one of the ability scores or causing exhaustion, they dole out negative levels, which is a mechanic from 3rd edition I'm not even going to begin to get into, but negative levels actually work kind of similarly to how exhaustion works in the 2024 rules, so that just sort of is what it is. But that's pretty much it. There's no thought-provoking inversion of the Earth Elemental, and there's no cool mechanics at play. It's basically just an Earth Elemental that does necrotic damage and sometimes gives you a semi-permanent debuff. What's also especially weird is that this creature in the original book isn't even a bespoke stat block, it's a template, meaning that you can theoretically turn any elemental into a necromental by giving it a couple traits. The example shown in the book just happens to be done with an Earth Elemental. So this isn't even truly the 4th elemental piece to our group of undead elementals here. It's essentially just a sticker that says undead guy, which can be slapped on any elemental creature, and that's so fucking odd. Now don't get me wrong, I think this could actually be a very useful template to have, but it's also a massive letdown when you realize it's filling in the slot which you were expecting to be filled by an awesome new undead take on a creature of elemental earth. This was an issue I had even back in my original video 8 years ago, but this time around I was determined to actually do something to fix it. I think a big part of the problem here is that Earth as an element in general is so much less defined than the other three when it comes to fantasy games. It's very easy to create a creature and say, oh yeah, that's what an Earth Elemental is, but it's actually kind of difficult to say what it isn't, if that makes any sense. Like, if we're gonna create a creature that falls in line with the themes of inversion, longing, and loss that are so delicately woven into the other three, what does that look like? I rolled this idea around in my head for weeks, and ultimately, when I was making the stat block for this video, I came to the conclusion that the Necromental just ain't it. I have heavily modified some creature stat blocks in the past because I really liked their concept, but felt like the execution was just kind of bad. But I think this might be the first time I just straight up tossed the entire thing out the window and started from scratch. Maybe there's a world in which we revisit the Necromental as a template for converting any elemental creature into an undead abomination, but today I took a crack at creating a worthy fourth member of the Undead Elemental crew. And here's what I came up with. When I think of Earth Elementals, I think of rich soil, churning rocks, and flourishing plants. At first I thought decay and rot could serve as their corrupted form, but that wasn't quite right. After all, plants need those things to survive too. No, the inversion of living Earth isn't death, that's all part of the cycle. The inversion of living Earth is entropy. Pitch tyrants are neither alive nor dead. The purest definition of an undead, as it turns out. They are hulking creatures with bodies made primarily of sickly, glistening tar, embedded with rocks and soil gone completely fallow, devoid of any nutrients. Any organic creature unlucky enough to cross paths with the monster are bound to end up as cracked bones drifting through the ever-flowing pitch that makes up most of their body. They have an insatiable hunger for life, specifically the life-giving nutrients found in fertile soil, though when there is no arable soil to be found, they'll settle for the nutrients they can harvest from living creatures. They're cursed to roam badlands, deserts, or any place corrupted by necromancy's thieving presence in a perpetual and desperate search for anything that might curb the bottomless hunger inside, but nothing ever does for more than a few moments. However, those moments are enough to drive them into constant action. Pitch tyrants are the most dangerous of the undead elementals. Clocking in at CR 8, they present a unique set of challenges to anyone bent on stopping their voracious rampage. As creatures who were once of elemental earth, they can, of course, use their massive fists to crush anyone in their path, causing both physical and acid damage to their prey. But that's not all. Seeing as how their bodies are made primarily of acrid tar, they automatically grapple anyone they strike in melee, which is very bad on account of their subsuming tar bonus action. This ability is kind of wordy, but basically if a pitch tyrant has someone grappled, it can pull them into its form, subsuming them in its tar-like essence. While subsumed, the creature is restrained, and they travel with the pitch tyrant if it moves anywhere else, and of course they can't breathe. Now they've also got a ranged attack that is more or less them tossing a giant glob of tar that deals bludgeoning and acid damage, as well as an action which I named Salt the Earth. This is something the pitch tyrant can do only once per day, but it allows them to absorb all nutrients from all of the soil and plant life in a 100-foot radius around itself, regaining a ton of hit points and also doing more or less the opposite of the spell plant growth, which in this case prevents anything from being grown in that soil for a full year. It also deals a bunch of necrotic damage to plant creatures in the area, which, if it comes up, pretty cool. I also gave this creature a handful of traits, two of which especially I feel will make for some fun combat encounters. The first is called Noxious Fumes, which is basically just a 10-foot aura around the creature that poisons and deals a bit of poison damage to anyone who ends their turn there on account of, well, the noxious fumes. The second trait is simply called Flammable Body, because as you may be aware, tar is really flammable, so if the pitch tyrant takes any fire damage, it begins to burn, which does deal a small amount of fire damage to it each round, but it also extends the radius of the noxious fumes out to 30 feet, because being around a burning tar pit isn't great for your health. Pitch tyrants are not only very dangerous, but also fill that niche of an inverted and corrupted undead creature, and thus after 2 decades, the elemental circle is complete. One last thing I do want to mention about these creatures when it comes to their stats, and this is true for all of them, is that they are all undead, but I also gave them the elemental tag, which is not legally a thing you can do. but it just made more sense than giving them a trait to explain that anything which affects either undead or elementals should also affect these creatures, since they're technically both. Just wanted to point that out because I'm sure some of you might have been a little confused by that, but we still haven't even talked about how you could use these creatures at the game table, so let's do that. Obviously, these creatures are all usable in the context you would typically see any other undead creature. They can make great minions for an evil necromancer or lich, they can be fantastic random encounters in a place that has been corrupted by evil, especially if the bio matches up with the element of choice, and they can always serve as a rogue monster summoned by a lesser cult who didn't know exactly what they were doing. But there are a few things you can explore with these creatures that go far beyond the norm. They of course proliferate by killing other elementals using their various abilities, but what you consider to be an elemental here might vary. Do those abilities only trigger against other basic elementals, or is it possible for, say, a Cinderspawn to turn a fire genasi into another Cinderspawn? Rules as written, elemental creatures of the same type have disadvantage to resist the effects of these undead, which is likely only to ever come up for the players if one of them is playing as a genasi of the correct lineage, or incorrect in this case, I guess, because it's going to be bad for them. But what about other creatures like the Aarakocra or any of the genies? I think it makes sense that they would also rise up as corrupted undead from their corresponding elemental undead attackers, but in the case of a creature like a genie, I would take it even a step further. You could totally have an undead genie act as a tiered up, more powerful version of any of these creatures, using the lesser versions as minions and wreaking all kinds of havoc on their respective plane. An outbreak of undeath on the plane of air could be like a zombie infestation in a human city, except with way cooler and more dangerous zombies. I also like the idea that if any of these creatures manage to get somewhere that consistently feeds their need to consume, it might not fix them or even placate them permanently, but it could make them more docile until a more attractive option comes along. Maybe you have some Desiccators just kind of floating by in an ocean current, sort of dormant until they decide that the blood of the living is nearby, and that seems better than more ocean water. Or you could have some Cinderspawn hanging out in a volcano. In fact, maybe they're trying to force that volcano to erupt with the hopes that it will provide enough powerful magical energy to cure them of their sorry state, never mind all the cities at the base of the mountain. You could even have a pitch tyrant who occupies a trash heap in a city, not really composting anything, but at least devouring all of the organic matter thrown there by its denizens. Maybe the trash heap is even what caused the creature to become a corrupted earth elemental in the first place. You could also do something with the Cinderspawn in an area like a desert, where during the day, they just lay out in the sun and are not exactly content, but they're relatively calmed by the intense heat. Though at night, when things get cold, the Cinderspawn go almost feral, desperate to consume every last bit of warmth they can find. In such an area, having a campfire at night would be a very dangerous proposition. Something else you can do with all of these creatures in various ways is a good old-fashioned fake-out. The Desiccator is probably the easiest to do this with. You just have the party come across some desiccated bodies drained of all their blood, and they are likely to assume that there's a vampire in play. Can't really blame them, that's a tale as old as time. And it is a terrifying discovery, especially if they're lower level, but once they discover the truth of the matter, they might be less worried about its power level, but certainly more disturbed, especially if there's a group of them. I also really love the idea of a pitch tyrant finding its way into the rural farmland of some kingdom. The farmers are all confused about these 200-foot wide crop circles that have been just appearing each day, all of their crops within dying and the soil going bad, only to discover a pitch tyrant has been feeding on their land, which creates a massive problem not just for the farmers, but also for the villages that rely on their food to last through the winter. There's also always the possibility that these creatures can be fixed in some way, either by allowing them to move on or by straight up returning them to life. Perhaps if you toss a Cinderspawn into a volcano, it does provide enough raw energy to satiate their hunger and return them to form. Or maybe dunking a Desiccator in the ocean does the same thing. Having these corrupted elementals simply be the symptom of a much larger problem, and giving your players a way to fix that problem could be a really cool adventure. But whatever you choose to do, all 4 of these stat blocks are linked in the description down below in the form of a Google document for free, as always. And if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you can find the high-res PDF versions of all these stat blocks, which contains the same game information, but just has a much fancy schmancier layout, is that even a word? I say it all the time. It's got a nicer layout. It gives you something you can stick in your DM folder, and it helps support me and the channel and making the content that I make here. But speaking of which, that does bring us to the part of the show where we talk about our randomly selected patron of the week. So thank you so much to Watcher9132 for all the support you send my way. I truly appreciate it. My apologies to Watcher9131 and 9133. You were so close. But thank you so much for watching. Couldn't do it without you. And as always, if there's a monster from a previous edition of Dungeons & Dragons or some other role-playing game that you think would make a great addition to the newest edition of Dungeons & Dragons, let me know in the comments down below or in the Dungeon Dad Discord, which is also linked down there somewhere. And who knows, you might see it show up on a future episode of Monster of the Week. I can't believe that October is finally over. I hope your spooky season was fantastic this year. I know that I had a great time carving pumpkins, watching horror movies, making unspeakable undead abominations for your viewing pleasure. It was great. Starting next week, we'll be returning to our regular programming. I don't know if it's the next video, maybe the one after that, but sometime soon, we got another dragon in the chamber. It's gonna be a cool one, kind of starting us out on the next chapter of converting dragons from a different family into the new rules. So I'm looking forward to getting started on that, so you can look forward to that in November. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching once again, and happy Halloween.